Hello YouTube, this is the Asian Theist here, and I hope 2024 is treating you well. As my first video in a long time, I figured it would be a good idea to experiment a bit on what to upload to YouTube. It's no secret that critics of Christianity who are most prominently atheists have a habit of pretending to be Bible scholars and would frequently cite disturbing areas of the Bible in order to criticize and paint a negative picture of God. Unfortunately, far too many people take these criticisms seriously, and so I wondered if it would be a good idea to make a series addressing at least some of those evil and disturbing passages. In this video, we will be addressing one of the most popular stories, Abraham and Isaac. While I may not be the first person to speak on this issue, I hope to contribute to the conversation in some meaningful way. Unlike other response videos where I focus on one particular YouTuber, I instead use a variety of different sources and attempt to refute them all at once. That way I can tackle the issue a little more thoroughly. And to keep things simple, I'm going to primarily discuss the Christian interpretation of this story. Now, without further delay, let's get down to business. After multiple doses of extra-strength Tylenol, I was barely able to persevere through the hours of mental detritus that are atheist critiques. And while I may not have viewed all critical materials on the subject, I do have limits after all, I believe I have acquired an adequate understanding of their criticisms. When it comes to the binding of Isaac, the complaints boil down to this. God is an evil child abuser for ordering a human sacrifice of a child, no less, and that Abraham was likewise an evil child abuser and possibly mentally deranged for obeying. These depictions, and others like it, are more caricature than fact, and if you feel inclined to disagree with me, here's what you should keep in mind. 1. Isaac was not a child. As you should all know, the Bible was not originally written in English, so sometimes when trying to decipher the whole picture, it is important to look to the original Hebrew. From what I could find, the ancient Hebrew word used for boy is, and forgive my pronunciation, ne'er, and this word can and has been used frequently to refer to young adults. This means that it is possible that Isaac could have been well into his 20s by the time Abraham was called to sacrifice him. This notion is not a modern invention, by the way, as there are ancient historians like Josephus Flavius, for instance, who have claimed, in writing, that Isaac was actually 25 years old when the so-called sacrifice took place. Links are in the description. 2. Isaac was likely a willing participant. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born, and if Josephus's interpretation on Isaac's age is to be believed, Abraham would have had to have been about 125 years old by the time of the quote-unquote sacrifice, and as the Bible clearly establishes that Abraham and Isaac were alone during said sacrifice, I'm pretty sure you don't need me to explain how a 25-year-old man would fare against a 125-year-old. Josephus even writes that Abraham tells Isaac about God's request and that Isaac cooperated out of a sense of moral duty. However, let's go the extra mile here and assume for argument's sake that Isaac was a child during the events of Genesis 22. Even under these circumstances, Abraham would still be pretty old, possibly approaching or even within his 110s at that point. The Bible also establishes that Isaac was physically fit enough to perform manual labor, especially when you consider that it was Isaac who carried the wood for the altar. In either case, Isaac was of sufficient strength to resist a man old enough to be his great-grandfather in both the binding and the reclining on the altar. This means that the only plausible way the binding of Isaac could have happened based on the Bible is that if Isaac cooperated with Abraham. 3. Isaac was not in any danger. This was something even some atheists seem to suspect, but not fully grasp. Before the quote-unquote sacrifice, Abraham tells his servants that he and Isaac will return to them. Some Christians, including myself, see this as an obvious sign that Isaac wasn't going to be sacrificed. Atheists, however, claim that Abraham was simply lying to his servants to ensure that they wouldn't interfere with him. But was he really? Consider the following. In multiple parts of the Bible, God makes it pretty clear that Isaac was Abraham's heir and that through Isaac, Abraham would have many descendants, a fact acknowledged even by some atheists.
Well, I can't really go back on my word. See, I already told him that I would be rewarding him above all others.
What? When?
Oh, before the test ages ago.
What did you promise him?
Offspring.
Oh, and a fine job he's doing with the one he's got. How many more?
Well, eventually as many descendants as there are stars in the sky.
And how would Abraham's descendants arrive without an Isaac around? The atheists appear to disregard this. For the sake of argument, let's assume God doesn't contradict himself, at least not in this specific instance. Now, what kind of a God who doesn't contradict himself tells you that your son will be your heir and at the same time tell you to kill that same son? Unless you're willing to argue that God intends for Isaac to inherit Abraham's property as either a ghost or a corpse, the only conclusion we can draw is that Isaac has to live somehow. I wonder how that happens. Many Christians would be content to just run with the fact that God stops Abraham and just leave it there. But our atheist friends in their zeal point out that the angel of the Lord only stops Abraham just as he was about to kill Isaac. This shows that Abraham fully anticipated the possibility of having to kill his son. Thus, the defense that Abraham knew he would be stopped falls apart. Unfortunately, what the atheists and even some Christians seem to neglect is that the Bible actually covers this factor in Hebrews chapter 11 verses 17 through 19, which states that Abraham trusted God to raise Isaac from the dead. According to the Bible, Abraham anticipated that God would resurrect Isaac if he had to kill him. So in all likelihood, given the promise of many descendants through Isaac and that Abraham apparently knew of God's abilities to restore Isaac, Abraham was actually telling the truth when he said he and Isaac were returning in Genesis 22:5. But our atheist friends are seldom satisfied and would likely state that even if all the above were true, the test was in any case immoral. This brings me to point 4. God was morally allowed to give this test. One consistent complaint from virtually every atheist critique I've seen so far is that this situation would be abhorrent in any other context. However, what they neglect, once again, is that this was not every other context, this was an exceptional context. The context being that a literal God was overseeing the test personally. And no, this is not special pleading, nor is it appeal to authority, and I will tell you why. Assuming God really did talk to Abraham, atheists assert that the moral thing to do would be to refuse God altogether, or to dismiss the communication as coming from a malevolent spirit. However, the people back in ancient times would definitely disagree with that. In Josephus's writings, we clearly see that both Abraham and Isaac cooperated with the sacrifice with the understanding, and I quote, "It would have been unjust if he had not obeyed," unquote. So immediately we understand that Abraham and Isaac did what they thought was moral. And in those days, and even today in some respect, obedience to God and obedience to morality are one and the same. This notion was supported even by Greek philosophers like Aristotle, for instance, who wrote in Book 3, Chapter 13 of Politics, and I quote, "For men of preeminent virtue there is no law. They are themselves a law. Mankind will not say that such an one is to be expelled and exiled. On the other hand, he ought not to be a subject. That would be as if mankind should claim to rule over Zeus, dividing his offices among them." Aristotle expands on the authority of the gods or someone of godlike authority in Book 3, Chapter 17 of Politics, where he states, and I quote, "To give them authority is not only agreeable to that ground of right, which the founders of all states, whether aristocratical or oligarchical, or again democratical, are accustomed to put forward, for these all recognize the claim of excellence, although not the same excellence. The whole is naturally superior to the part, and he who has this preeminence is in the relation of a whole to a part. But if so, the only alternative is that he should have the supreme power and that mankind should obey him, not in turn, but always. So what does any of this mean? Aristotle was advocating for a full incorporation of meritocracy in matters of government, and possibly in ethical decisions too. I'm pretty sure even the most die-hard atheist will concede that the thing about being a god is that you're supposed to be infinitely more powerful and knowledgeable than mortals, at least by default. You may not agree with this view, but that's how godhood is defined, at least in many mainstream religions. If beings like that were to exist, then humanity as a whole would be morally obligated to obey them, as they are essentially our superiors due to their extraordinary abilities. How this applies to Abraham and Isaac is fairly straightforward. Abraham's obedience to God to sacrifice Isaac was actually the moral choice. He was following the principles of a meritocracy by obeying someone who was essentially all-knowing and all-powerful, or at least more so than he was. Appeal to authority and special pleading would not apply simply because if God did not know what he was doing, then he wouldn't be all-knowing just by definition. Atheists will likely retort by saying,
there are countless numbers of people throughout history who have killed their own children and said God told them to do it. Now, I very much doubt the fundamentalist Christians, if sitting on a jury, would let them get off innocent because they did it because of their faith.
They'd be like, no one talks to God.
Yeah, there's no difference. Abraham has no more proof that God told him to kill their kids than these people did.
Excuse me, but what more proof did Abraham require at that point? He was 100 years old when he managed to impregnate his 90-year-old wife, who was, by the way, considered infertile beforehand. Not to mention his connections and communications with God have been verified by multiple witnesses, including Sarah, his wife, and two different monarchs, King Abimelech and Pharaoh. He had a lot more to go on than just a voice and/or intuition in his head, so this idea that he was suffering from some mental illness is nothing short of a straw man. Some critics have asked, how did Abraham know that it was God and not Satan telling him to sacrifice Isaac? The only response I can give is that if you've read all the chapters in Genesis before 22, it's practically taken for granted that God was actively looking out for Abraham. So no, Abraham would not think for a minute that it was Satan talking to him, because if Satan did try something, then God could be counted on to intervene. 5. This was not human sacrifice. Another common issue from most critiques I've seen is that it seems pretty hypocritical that God would claim to be against human sacrifice while at the same time asking Abraham to sacrifice his son. This is an obvious false analogy, as there is simply no comparison between Abraham and Isaac and the human sacrifice practiced by other cultures. Remember, this was going to end one of two ways. Either God stops Isaac or God resurrects Isaac. For one, the knife never even touched Isaac, so that's immediately an obvious deviation. How can it be human sacrifice given that the ritual was clearly left incompleted? Even if Isaac was killed, that still wouldn't count, because the point of a human sacrifice is that you're giving up a life to a deity. If the person you sacrifice just comes back to life shortly afterwards, that defeats the purpose of the whole procedure. I'm no anthropologist, but if I came from a culture that regularly performed human sacrifice, and I witnessed an incident where a sacrificed person was resurrected shortly after being killed, I would probably interpret that as a sign that the offering was rejected. There's also the argument that it wasn't the command, but much rather the intent behind the command. This is another factor that's taken for granted on all sides of the argument. Isaac's sacrifice was never the desired end goal in the first place. The end goal was to test Abraham. So what was the point of the whole test? If God knew Abraham so well, why even bother testing him? The way I see it, the point is that while God knew Abraham, other people didn't. As Christians and Jews tend to interpret this story to be a moral lesson on obedience to God, it can easily be interpreted that this test was for both the benefit of Abraham and the benefit of future believers. So how does that work? Here's an example. Let's say there was a coach trying to show off a star pupil to an audience who had no prior knowledge of this pupil. Since the audience isn't as familiar with the star pupil as the coach, it would usually be a good idea to have the star pupil show off their skills to prove their worth. The same could be said for Abraham. Humans are obviously not omniscient, so it's hardly surprising that we simply need more proof than God. In other words, the test was merely a formality to demonstrate Abraham's devotion in the most explicit way possible. So why did God have to test Abraham in such a severe way? Isaac was Abraham's most valued person in his life. What God is trying to show is that obedience to a divine authority takes priority even above those we deeply care about. This way of thinking was widely shared in the ancient world even by some of the most prominent intellectuals, and the merits of this are still discussed today in modern ethics. Given everything that has been said so far, if you were to ask me if I would have been able to kill Isaac if I were Abraham, the short answer is yes. Abraham had every reason to believe God was in fact talking to him. There was no reason to consider the command immoral from both Abraham's and Isaac's perspectives, and there was likewise no reason to fear for Isaac's safety. Anyone who tries to tell you otherwise, based on the critiques I've seen so far, is probably guilty of trying to substitute emotional outrage for an actual argument. Pretty ironic for the so-called champions of reason. How would it feel for you as a parent if God told you to kill your child? Appeal to emotion fallacy. I can't tell the difference between God and Satan sometimes. I'm sorry you feel that way, but God's not accountable to you. You're using special pleading. Special pleading only applies when I fail to provide adequate justification for an exception. I did provide adequate justification by appealing to God's superiority. If God was not allowed to do this, then he wouldn't be superior by definition. Why does an omniscient God need Abraham to acknowledge him when called? It's called etiquette. Look it up. Wasn't Ishmael also Abraham's son? Doesn't God know how to count to 2? Ishmael was disowned, in case you forgot, so while he may be biologically Abraham's son, he may as well be non-existent when it comes to certain family ties, like who gets the inheritance. Why didn't Abraham's servants intervene during the binding of Isaac? Because they were left with the donkey so that Abraham and Isaac could worship alone, so chances are the servants were simply out of sight. Wouldn't Isaac be traumatized after such an experience? Perhaps, but so many experiences in your life could be considered traumatic. When you fall down and scrape your knee, that could be considered traumatic. When you get knocked to the ground and tackled while playing football, that could be considered traumatic. When you get punched, kicked, and or shoved while practicing martial arts, that could also be considered traumatic. None of these acts constitute something concerning despite being traumatic. While trauma is challenging, it can easily be seen as a necessary evil in certain contexts. Why didn't Abraham voice any objections when called to sacrifice Isaac? This depends on who you ask. Some sources I've seen state that such details simply weren't deemed essential by the authors, given that the Bible was not intended to be read the same way as books today, which may or may not be the case. I, however, have a different interpretation to put forward. Abraham was well past the age of 100 years at that point. He had witnessed enough of God's extraordinary abilities to know he could fully trust him. The fact that he even had a son at all at his advanced age with an old infertile woman like Sarah was already proof that God was capable of defying expectations. Why did God see the need to repeat his promises to Abraham over and over again? To show that he hadn't forgotten about them and to amplify them in the process. Why didn't God stop Abraham himself instead of relying on an angel? Short answer, he never promised to, he was not obligated to, and he didn't need to. Furthermore, this is just speculation on my end, but if Abraham was able to differentiate between God's voice and an angel's voice, that might be further proof for Abraham that he was in direct communication with God and not under the influence of a mental disorder and or malevolent spirit. This is especially the case as even atheists concede that angels are the representatives/mouthpieces of God. If the Bible is the Word of God, then why doesn't God make the Bible easier to understand without the need to appeal to scholars and historians? That is an obvious display of ethnocentrism. Unless you plan on becoming a scholar, a historian, or in your case a Bible critic, it is not a moral requirement to understand everything the Bible says. Also, if you read Acts chapter 8 verses 26, the Bible even acknowledges that the good book can be difficult to fully comprehend. What if Abraham had disobeyed? As far as I know, the worst thing that would have happened to Abraham had he disobeyed is that God would have just revoked his covenant blessings with Abraham and moved on to find someone else. If you weren't a Christian, you wouldn't be defending this. Circumstantial ad hominem. The arguments need to be evaluated on their own merits. They are not immediately invalidated simply because of my apparent motives. Well, that's just about it. If there's anything I've missed, let me know in the comments, and I may consider making a follow-up to this video. Be sure to like, share, comment, and or subscribe if you want to help the channel grow, and tap the bell icon to be notified immediately when the next video is up. In the meantime, this is the Asian Theist, signing off.